story in it, and saw the need, and then it was an overwhelming, fulfilling experience just to be able to attack the issues that are confronting our people in education.
You know what? I think that key word right there kind of sets the tone for our conversation today with education. Before we started filming, we had conversations earlier, especially with yesterday. But giving some backdrop, when we look at the world today, we're dealing with COVID-19, which is a global pandemic. We're talking about systemic racism issues that have bubbled up to the top, where it's on the minds and the hearts of those across the entire country as an issue now that we have to address. Where do we start as a community? And when I talk about where do we start, I mean, where do our people start in terms of seizing the moment and truly having a transformational moment in history? So I'll open it up anyone that want to take that.
Well, I would start by saying, in the words of one of our great scholars, Dr. Wright, we have to begin with the only true battle that remains, which is a battle for the black mind. I think that all of those systems that we speak of that are detrimental to humanity, and especially African people in particular, are the tentacles of global white supremacy, the mindset of global white supremacy, which I feel is the greatest threat to humanity. So when we spoke about the pandemic, COVID, to me that's a sub category of global white supremacy. Why that would even be allowed to come into existence as a bunch of the ills in society. So I really believe that where we begin is the mindsets, and I believe the mindsets are formulated through all of our institutions, educational, political, social, all of the institutions in society. So we have to begin to re-examine our place, our truth. The missing pages of history are African history, and those pages are the things that we need to correct what is imbalance on the planet now, because the imbalance exists because the lies has been allowed to continue. And in order to return to a place of balance, which we call the principles of mind, truth, justice, righteousness, balance, order, reciprocity, we must correct our thinking and understand that we're victims, but not just victims, we are also progenitors of that victimization by our mindsets. So that's where I believe we should begin.
So it's kind of like a reprogramming.
Yes.
It's like our minds are a computer, right? It's the hard drive, and we got to push a hard reset.
Absolutely, because if you think of one of the medias that we consume a great deal is television, and if we use that in just the term of what it says, tell a vision, this is where we're getting our vision. So if we're consuming images that demean us, if we see ourselves depicted as criminals, if we see ourselves only in certain light, through that, and our children, and as a people, we are a symbolic people, a visual people. When we consume all of that, then that is the programming that what you just spoke about that needs to be reset. So we're combating internal mental processes without the cultural base to spring forth from with. And that's why we culturally have to reconnect with our roots, and that's why the history is so important, that we stop that slave narrative.
Right. What's your thoughts on where do we start from here? We have the concept or the philosophy of reprogramming our mindset, but how do we help our people to start the process of reclaiming and redefining our path in the future?
Right. It's interesting that in this pandemic, everything has slowed down. And a number of people, just today, as a matter of fact, my brother here said, it's given us a chance to look at history. I think Missy Elliott just said that I've learned more about my own history in the last month or two than I ever did in my whole life, So this gives us a chance to look at our history. The reason why history is important is because, like the saying said in 1984, the one who controls the present controls the past. The one who controls the past controls the future. So, and the reason why you control the future is because you can only have expectations in terms of where you've been.
Right.
Then you know how deep you can go in terms of where you need to go. So let's look at the past. I'm always big on looking at the past, and you have to slow down and give me a moment, because we're going to look at where we were 100 years ago, 1919, 1920, and it was a pandemic there. Soldiers coming back, being killed in their uniforms.
Right.
You had racial violence in over 100 cities, the Red Summer. But then you also had a man who came and in 4 years went from welfare to building a $10 million organization, which is equivalent to $100 million today. That's Marcus Garvey. He sold out Madison Square Garden for a week. They had to put speakers outside for him to hear. Right. And 4 million people, at the time there was only 4 million people inside the United States, 4 or 5 million people inside the United States. He had 4 million people worldwide. Why was his message at that time taken and ran around the world? He only came here to look at Booker T. Washington's model of a vocational school and take it back to Jamaica. But when he got here, his energy and his vision, it took off. And why? Because the time was right. And now what you find, the time is right. But we have to look at what did they do to counter that momentum. And if we know what they did then, we know the game plan for what they'll do now. I played sports, and one of the things we did was look at films. And so we would look at films over and over and over, because we knew at a certain time the so-called opposition would do certain things when we did certain things. So now that we're in a moment where we're returning back to our blackness, we're returning back to the source. See, my generation, they gave us integration, and we're going to talk about that later, but what it did was it blurred the line between black and white. When you blur the line between black and white, then you no longer see the main problem. Like W.B. Du Bois says, the problem in the 20th century is going to be the color line. Well, they just blurred the color line. So now that we see the color line for what it is, now it's a potent time, once again, like it was in the 1920s, to make the certain moves that we must move in the future.
You know, as I sit and I listen, I look through several different lenses, right? I look through the lens of a legislator sometimes when I listen to folks, because we have to listen for the problem, right? And sometimes listening to the problems, you hear the solutions from the people at the same time. And I try to marry that ideal to figure out how do we get there together, right?
Yeah.
I was taught that if you want to make long-term change, you have to change policies. You have to change laws. You can look at this Voting Rights Act and so many other pieces of legislation. Although this nation is not perfect, the gains we have made through policy has somewhat advanced us in society. But we're still not treated equally. We're still not treated fairly.
Right.
And I think that's what we're seeing today is a rise of consciousness of folks saying that injustice is enough. We're done with injustice. So how do we articulate that message and continue to educate our communities that enough is enough and that we have to have a collective voice?
Well, I think that's very important, because one dynamic is true is that only the dissatisfied make change. And I think part of the blurring of the line that Sundiata was speaking of is the illusion of achievement. You know, just a few years ago, they were talking with the election of Barack Obama about a post-racial America. So once we get beyond the illusions of progress and the illusion of power, we can address the real issues, which is the power dynamic has had little change. What we were marching for in the 60s was power. It was thought that we were going to gain that power with voting rights, with legislature, with changing, and we have made some gains with that. But the dynamic, the power dynamic has not really changed. And we need that autonomy in our community reflective of our needs. I think our needs get blurred or swept up into the broader society needs, and our needs are not the broader society needs. We're coming from a different place. We can't, for example, in terms of economics, there was a study that says that if Black America were to gain equality with white America economically. It would only occur if white America stopped spending and accumulating wealth today. It would still take us 228 years just to be on par with white America. So those are drastic numbers that we cannot simply say we participate in the same fashion to equal a scale. But there's pushback. You know, the pushback is we're getting advantages. We're in terms of affirmative action programs and those things, when it's proven that statistically white women were the greatest benefactors of those programs. So once again, we are there for the blame, but we've never had a program specifically designed for us, and the only way we want to have that program is with us coming up with the program. And then in terms of acceptance, whether the broader society is ready or willing to accept that is of no consequence to this generation. This generation, as you said, are saying no to injustice. So all these no to injustice. So just because people are alive now, you know, and the sins were sown then, that does not, you know, alleviate them from having to deal with the balancing of those injustices now. So our legislators and our leaders must make that demand because the people are making that demand.
And then also want to say on that, you know, we have to do two things at one time. And normally we pit them against each other. And that is that, yes, you can participate in the political process, but even more importantly, you have to remain as a community intact. If we look at other people, like we took a look at the Asian community, they don't really participate in the electoral process that much. But if you look at their standard of living, it's much higher than it's almost on par with whites, you know. And as a matter of fact, you know, yes, as part of earnings, and if you look at entering Ivy League schools and their success academically, Ivy League schools are now actually making laws to keep them from overtaking their schools. So what did they do? They retain their cultural integrity. So when an Asian child goes into the home, he sees his Asian self. He still sees that 1,000-year history. He still looks in the mirror and sees an Asian person. As opposed to the black child who goes at home to see a so-called N-word in the mirror and sees the person supposed to be a criminal and all the other stuff that America has given them, you know. We have to look at a person like Ed Barney, who's involved in propaganda. For some strange reason, he spoke at the second NAACP award. We still haven't figured out why. Because he was a very deadly person in terms of his ability to manipulate the mind. He was Sigmund Freud's nephew, and he came up with a campaign to get women to start smoking. And he linked the cigarette with the phallic symbol and the power symbol, and he got women, he fooled women into thinking that if you smoke, you somehow become more and more masculine. And it was a tremendous success. Then he went to South America and got the United States public to back a war in South America against the people who were innocently attacked by the United States, but through the media were purposely led to believe that that so-called country was an enemy state. I say all that to say that, like he said, the battle in the future is going to be the battle over the black mind. And the one way we have to be clear about, we have to be clear in terms of we have to become insular in terms of our community while we participate politically with the rest of the communities. They like to give us the either or. Like if you're going to be political, just drop your whole community. And we're going to go to, like I said, once again, the Brown versus Board of Education, which I think really lays that out in terms of what happened to us as a people.
Well, let's start there. Let's start with the Brown versus Board of Education in terms of education as it is today.
Right.
As educators, and I'm sure you've talked to educators that came before you, what has changed? What have you seen change? And and when did that direction start to shift? And you spoke earlier before we started filming in terms of the quality of educators in the past that were even in our own high schools. So when did that shift and change started happening from the quality perspective?
Great question. Well, let's first look at what we had, and Tootie's going to talk about blacks in the South and what happened after the Civil War and how we as a people, first time any people went from illiteracy to literacy so quickly because that hunger for education was there. But let's look at the Brown versus Board of Education, which to me is one of the most insulting decisions that they come across every year in and year out as an achievement, when really it's not. It's the greatest work of Machiavellian politics I've ever seen in my life. So if you look at the Brown family initially said they did not want their child to have to walk and take a bus to go to a school way across town when there was a school near them that their child could safely walk to. It had nothing to do with the quality of the school. So what the United States did, definitely with Thurgood Marshall's help, and Thurgood Marshall had his own issues. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But with Thurgood Marshall's help, they made it appear as though the black school was inferior to the white school, playing upon the notion that the things that we learn in our institutions were somehow less than white institutions. So then now you have, later on, you see black children, they'll see an all-black school, and they'll call it a ghetto school. See a black business, they'll call it a ghetto business. Why? Because internally, what they have internalized is the fact that whatever we control 100% is somehow not as good as, and sometimes perceived as worse than what they have. So Robert's Board of Education says that a black child cannot get a quality education sitting next to another black child being taught by a black teacher. That's what it says. Thurgood Marshall says that we have to be in the presence of white educators with white children so that our education will be equal as. And that's not what the Brown family wanted initially. So, and the United States went with that because they knew we can use this to do two things: enforce the mental subjugation of the people, and also destroy the institutions of that people. We lost $240 million worth of income in that first year alone. There was a case after that in Moby, Missouri, where a black woman with a PhD was fired, and they fired 10 other black educators. They kept 121 white teachers. Some of them only had a temporary license. So what they did was take that and they fired 35% to 50% of the black teachers in the South. They basically devastated the black community because at that time the black teacher was more than a teacher. My mother's from Oklahoma. Her father had never been to school. Her mother went to the 3rd grade, and she relied all her information in terms of what you should do in life came from that black teacher in that classroom. When you remove that black teacher, and in many cases you had a hostile white teacher, and you placed that black child in front of, that started us on the road to what we call the school to prison pipeline that we look at today, where the black male child is sitting in the back of the class, the black female child is ignored, and then we wonder why we have this issue with our children pushing back on black education.
It's just a question I got because you brought something up, and I always wanted to get people's thoughts on this conversation. The debate on did integration help or hurt the black community? I'd love to get you guys' thoughts and perspectives on that.
I want to get to that. I want to start with the education in the South. I'm going to go to the Civil War, and we'll get to the, because Tony has some great information on blacks in the South and the philanthropists who shape our education experience.
Yeah. Okay, there's just to lay the foundation of the mindset to get us to Brown. If we go back to the attitude of education of Africans in general, in the North and the South. Particularly in the South, we know that there were laws against teaching quote-unquote slaves to read, and it was despite that. In the book of Education of Blacks in the South, there was a study done in 1866, that's the dawn of slavery, in which they had over 560 odd free schools for blacks in 1866, which means they were founded before that. So they were harboring these schools in the South during slavery, and they called them hush harbor meetings, where we were still learning in spite of penalty of torture and then sometimes death. So the thirst for knowledge among our people has always been there. Now fast forward from 1866 to 1930. We went from 0% literacy to over 80% literacy. That's the greatest intellectual growth in the history of public education. And our people did that. Our people financed their own schools. At times like now, we would take taxes when our tax dollars were not spent. We would tax ourselves again to make sure our children had education. We would always, they had a little group called the Snuff Box Brigade, who went around with a snuff box to get money for schools. Mary McLeod Bethune founded Bethune-Cookman College with $1.54. So we always had the thirst for knowledge. But if you fast forward, this credit for these efforts were going to white philanthropists. They were going to Rosenthal, who had a fund. He was an executive with Sears and Roebuck. and they would call it the Rosenthal School, and those schools were primarily the blacks in the area would fund the schools, and he'd come in with maybe 20% because they couldn't be hired. So those things impacted our educational system, and when we failed to start sacrificing for the generations of the future, you see this, we felt that we were handing them over into good hands, and as he said, these were hostile situations most of the time, and then the after effects in terms of achievement, the numbers don't lie. We achieved better pre-integration than we have post-integration. That's without question.
So we see some of the deterioration of our school systems across the country.
Without a doubt.
And
It's planned.
when you say it's planned, help us unpack that.
Well, what we don't realize, before Brown versus Board of Education, there was a suit brought before the Supreme Court, and it had to do with funding. And actually, there was another fight after, because integration didn't totally alleviate the fact that we still had all black schools. And so what we found is that black people were, as Judy said, were paying taxes, and we found that our taxes were actually being diverted to go to the other side of town. So they were purposely starving our schools when it came to funding. So that was a big issue before and after. So they finally set a ceiling. They said all schools must have $7,000 per child. And so how whites got around that, because they had all the dominant businesses in their community, they were able to tax their businesses. And then all of a sudden they were $14,000 per child, and we were still at $7,000 per child because they were pulling out. And if we did get businesses in our community, we would have to make deals with them so that they were not taxed, so that they could stay in our community. So it was these kind of games that we're playing with the funding, because all the while what Brown versus Board of Education should have pushed for, we want access. We're not saying we want access, we deserve access, we should be able to go anywhere we want to go, but it should not come at the breaking down of our institutions. And as a matter of fact, what Brown should have said was, we want funding for black institutions just as well as funding for white institutions. Every school in America, the one place a child should go and have a positive, great experience is a public school in the so-called wealthiest country in the world, where you're spending more on weaponry than the top 10 countries combined. You should have the best experience at a school if you're a child. I don't care if you're coming out of a household or you're coming under a tent, which a lot of our children are being on the street. They should have the best experience in a classroom. We have the funding to do that.
So there's a term or two words I want to bring up. And I would love to get your thought or definition, because some people don't really understand the difference between equality and equity. How would you articulate to someone the difference between equality and equity? Because there is a difference in certain instances, especially in education.
Well, I would say equity means that you have an equal chance or equal opportunity at a resource or at an opportunity to participate. Whereas equality would be more of you have the same or identical experience. And what we really were fighting for and continue to fight for now is equity. Because my experience is not going to be the same experience as people from another community, because education is culturally based. And we always omit that and believe that because you have the same technology or the same textbook that you're getting the same education, and that's simply not true. The term education comes from the root educare, which means to bring forth from. So that's coming forth from our culture. Now, the claim, the racist historical claim, is that we had no culture, which is an absolute lie. We had no language, which is an absolute lie. There's over 800 different dialects spoken on the African continent. That we had no structure, which is an absolute lie. Because that reinforces dehumanizing of our ancestors and us currently, and which justifies the ill treatment. So the difference again is people say that they want to be equal. I don't think we really want equality, because equality means you're erasing your African heritage, you're erasing your community and your culture, and meaning that you will have to force yourself to be something that you cannot, which is a European and a European culture. Nor should we be seeking that. So to me, that's the difference.
Well, any thoughts on that?
I want to put that back on exactly who we are, and then when we say equality, and we say one thing's equal, the great, I don't call him historian, but Amos Wilson, who wrote the book Black Power, says, do we understand what we mean by when we ask in a society to make things equal? Do we really know how much wealth has to be transferred from one group to the other? And we think we're saying things that aren't fighting words, when in actuality they're to a white ear or to the power structure's ear, those are words of war, you know. But I want to get back to what Brother Taudi says when we get into our history. And it's very important. When a black child understands that mathematics was founded in Africa, when a black child understands, like we were speaking earlier, when Napoleon went to Egypt, and historian looked at the great works, and he said, you know, it's amazing, these groups of people that we hold and despise today gave us mathematics, science, astronomy, and our ability to even speak. We ourselves don't really understand, have a true appreciation for black. We don't understand that the science is finding more and more that we're 500,000 years old, and the Ankh that we think originated in Egypt or Kemet actually originated further, much further south. And we don't understand that we don't even know where the beginning of the thought of Egypt arrived. Because when Egypt was built, it was already full bloom. That means the beginning came from somewhere else. And we still don't understand what the Dogon, how the Dogon were able to look at the universe. That NASA still thinks there's aliens to this day because they look at this African tribe. And if you talk to a black child about Africa or being African, they'll tell you that I'm not African. They hate that. And as Malcolm said, it's so still true today. You cannot hate the root without hating the tree. And these are true. We say them, but we don't really understand. These are true. Once again, a Japanese child will go home and see Japanese artwork on the wall and appreciate the fact that they're looking at something that's 800 years old. An African child will go home and look at something and do not equate it to ownership. And we can look at the fact that if you look at an African child, they're the smartest family in London is an African child. You can Google it and look it up. They're the smartest family. They're teenagers, and they scored the highest score to get into Oxford. And they did that because they retained their Africanness. And now we're finding at the Ivy League level that more and more African children born on the continent are getting in and doing well than African children who were put through the mental hazing here in America.
Wow. I hate to digress, but I have to ask you guys this because you are extremely knowledgeable on everything that we're talking about. Who do you give credit to? Who were your mentors? I heard you say this word earlier. Who was your mentors that planted those seeds in you to have this consciousness of our culture and this appreciation of our history?
Well, first, I guess my first mentor, I have to give credit to Brother Ashworth Kwesi, who named me. He was a chematologist, which is the study of Egypt, basically. Egypt's ancient name is Kemet, which meant the black land. And he touched me because of all of the studies that we go through. You know, religion has a huge impact, an influence on us. And he had a presentation called The African Origin of Judeo-Christianity. And I saw the presentation from my brother-in-law, who was a Muslim, and it impacted me so that I had to meet the brother. I met the brother, had the brother, I was in college at Grambling at the time, had him come down to Grambling, had him speak, and he was such a humble brother, humble in spirit, and it touched me. So he grabbed me and grabbed a hold of me, and I used to help him. I used to carry his slides and help him with his presentation when I came back here. And his impact on me was profound. The second would be Professor Earl Grant, who was second in charge to Malcolm X, He was vice president of the OAAU and Muslim Mosque Incorporated. Again, another humble, quiet spirit that you would never know contained this warrior spirit. And his story just inspired me to do anything and take on anybody. He was a high school dropout right here in the Los Angeles area in the 40s. He dropped out of Jefferson High School, went up to the service, came out of the service, met Brother Malcolm in Harlem, New York, became a member of the Nation of Islam, left the Nation of Islam before Brother Malcolm, and as soon as Brother Malcolm made the decision that he was no longer going to be in the Nation of Islam, the first person he picked up the phone and called was Brother Earl Grant, who drove over to his house and they had the conversation. And then in a year, and a little over a year plus after his departure, Brother Earl was with him every step of the way. He sent letters of his admiration for their friendship and advice for how the organization should progress in his step. So he was the second, and I was fortunate to be with him the last 20 years of his life, and we passed just last year. I've had some other influence, Brother Khalid Muhammad, who was with the Nation of Islam, another person we brought down to Grambling when I was there. And he, again, his tone, his nature, and his fierceness, his fearlessness had an impact on me. And in terms of research, I would say Brother Steve Coakley, another person I had become close with. He was in politics with Mayor Harold Washington in Chicago, and he was part of of his structure. And then eventually, he came out of that, and then he started teaching us about the hidden hands, the hands that influence politics. The Rockefellers, the Bilderbergs, and the different things, Council on Foreign Relations, all of these type of organizations that had global impact. So these are the ones that I would say were my mentors.
Wow. What about yourself?
Well, I think growing up in Carson, my parents were one of the first black teachers to integrate Compton High School, and growing up in Carson, an all-black setting with my friends who were just beautiful people. I looked up to his brothers, and my parents started a business, so I actually started the school in 1972, and it afforded us the ability to move across town, so we moved into Bel Air. But being in that environment and seeing these brothers who basically nurtured me, and I saw their good spirit, and we moved to Bel Air, and then I was around a bunch of Jews and white children, and then for the first time the race hit me, and then when looking back on my good friends and seeing them fall by the wayside, get into drugs and get into crime, and knowing the heart that they had, and being up on a hill and talking to people every day, especially my Jewish friends, I have to give it to them. They taught me nationalism, and taught me to look at the world in terms of the people. And when we went to school, they would come home at night and go study for their bar mitzvah, and the love they had of it for Israel, and the love and the concept of who they had of themselves. And I knew that at the time I didn't understand deeply what Africa was, but I asked myself, well, if you're Jewish and Israel is your base, I'm black, and Africa must be my base. And a friend of mine gave me a book, African Civilization by John G. Jackson. And after reading it, I went to my Jewish friends who dated black women, listened to black music, and loved black culture. And when I told them black people founded civilizations, he said, no, you guys were ape-like. So he was an Eminem type. And then it hit me that, okay, you can appear on the outside to appreciate black culture, but if you internalize the fact that white are supreme, then that's my first introduction to white supremacy. And so from that, I went to Howard University and I met a professor, Ron Walters. And Ron Walters was really instrumental. Ron Walters started the sit-in movements in North Carolina. He started in Wichita, Kansas, at a youth movement. He taught the youth there from North Carolina how to sit in. They went back to North Carolina and did that. He worked with Harold Washington and got him elected. He worked with Jesse Jackson. He was his campaign advisor. So he was my teacher, and he was my counselor at Howard. And then he was also a Pan-Africanist. And being at Howard, hearing John Henry Clark and Dr. Ben, and being able to meet Francis Cress Wilson, going to a class, and Zach Kondo and Tony Browder, it just, from back then, it just all came to fruition in terms of I understood why my friends were victimized in Carson, even though they had beautiful souls, and understood why my privileged friends on the Hill enjoyed a better life and a longer lasting life. with their nationalism. So then, it became crystal clear who we are and what we must do.
The book that Dr. King has, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. I want to, as we wrap up, and I think Dane is going to come out or come to the next segment and talk with us. Where do we go from here? Especially when it comes down to education. I know we didn't dive as deep as we probably will want to, because there's so much to unpack in the education realm right now, in terms of defunding, like you mentioned, in terms of the school-to-prison pipeline system, and the over-militarization or prison structure in some of our schools.
So I'm gonna over that real quick and I'll let Julie finish it and close it out in more in detail. But we have to look at Martin Luther King. Well, the biggest problem is we don't deal in truths. We deal in myths. We look back at history and they're giving us myths. And one of the big myths they gave us, and it really confuses us. I'm really surprised, Martin Luther King was colorblind. Martin Luther King believed that you should judge a man by the color of his skin, blah, 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 period, all the time. And actually, it shocked me when Martin Luther King was killed on April 4th. If you look at April 3rd, it also shocked me that he could only speak at 4 churches. All the other black churches did not want him to speak. And Martin Luther King was pariah in certain areas of civil rights movement because of his stances against the Vietnam War, but that was another thing. Let's go back to his speech. We all must pull up his speech on April 3rd. His speech on April 3rd, they always start at the beginning of the speech when he speaks about being a martyr and dying. And that he says longevity has its rewards. I, like any man, would love to live a long life, But I think but I see the promise, and we as a people are going to get it. It's a beautiful speech. But when you rewind it at the beginning, it opens your eyes. He says in that speech, we as a people would be considered, I think at that time, the 11th largest nation in the world. Maybe we should take our money and put it in black hands and black banks and black insurance companies. That is black nationalism. He went to his grave saying that we should take this organized effort, that we were able to open up society a little bit, and we should stay organized and use it for economic birth. We should keep this power as a collective group. And what society was able to do, or the dominant society was able to do, or white supremacy was able to do, was kill him and alter the message. And they were actually able to use the words of Martin Luther King to demilitarize us, so to speak, to make us not look at the color line once again. So I hear young black kids say, well, King didn't want us to look at color. When in actuality, King was organizing us based upon color at the very end of his life when he was killed at Loring Miracle.
Wow, no, that's strong.
It's powerful, and it's a very, I think, clear message is that we must reclaim our martyrs and we must reclaim our children. I think the image of King and the image of Brother Malcolm has been distorted. The messages has been distorted. When they speak of King, they talk about the early days, and King was formulating. He was not widely supported as people project. He was not widely supported. The NAACP, if you read the articles, they were at war with the SCLC. They were tired of him going and getting in jail, and then they would have to come in and do these things. So he was not widely supported, but his contentions were that we still must make a stand. And I think our contemporary conversation has been avoid, as opposed to make a stance. And then our youth have always been at the forefront of stances being made. And then the so-called leadership is playing catch-up to what the youth has said, this is no more. So if we look at where do we go from here, we have to make the truthful stance and be honest about where we are. If this is a war, we must be honest and say it is a war. And there are casualties in war, and there are goals and territory to be gained in war. And we cannot be content with earning almost $6 trillion in this country and not control industries. That's not education. You see, we cannot be content with our earning power and not being able to employ our children. That's not education. So when we say where do we go, we have got to instill a sense of identity. We cannot be absorbed into the broader so-called American culture and expect to survive. The Italians come in and they have little Italian. The Ethiopians come in and have little Ethiopian. The Chinese come in and have little Chinatown. We come in and we say we're everybody.
Right.
And we expect ourselves to have some sort of progress or claim on the quote-unquote economic pie. It will never happen. We'll only be consumers. We will never use our consumption dollars for our people's upward mobility, and we will always be considered the same as when we were brought over here, which was we were brought over here to make other people wealthy. And we have continued in that mode even in 2020. We are still here, but we're making other people wealthy, and that's not education.
And what part of an education right now is that we're in flux in terms of where we're moving because our neighborhoods are being literally attacked with gentrification. We are finding ourselves being pushed out of central or decades-old neighborhoods that we were once in. And so we have a problem with education because we are not in control of education. We're still feeling the effects of Brown versus the board. We don't have any control over our education, nowhere. So I think Damon mentioned it earlier that Black principals are afraid. You cannot be afraid and have leadership at the same time. You can't occupy the same space. That's not leadership. So we have a problem in the fact that we are vulnerable people when it comes to educating our own children. I have to think about what I am saying to our children. I have to think about that in terms of my livelihood, and I can't teach the children the truth. I have to first think about what is another person thinking before I talk to my children. So that's one of the problems. The other problem is the fact that our children are suffering from the dilemma of the United States becoming more and more expensive and their parents are becoming more and more unemployable. So that's a terrible place to be in. It's becoming more and more expensive. The dollar's becoming more and more hard to obtain while their parents are not adapting to that environment because they're basically being warred upon economically by the dominant society, which is moving to computers and bringing immigrations in. Immigration started in 1950, not the immigration you see coming from Mexico, but the H-1B visa integration, where intellectual property is being taken from other people in terms of bodies, in terms of engineers. So therefore, I don't have to educate an engineer now in America. I could just go buy one. And that's why you go to universities of UCLA and USC, and children from India and China, when they graduate from school, walk over the bodies of Black children in the street to go enter into USC and UCLA. So that's a problem.
Dave, what's your thoughts, man? I mean, you listen to this conversation.
Well, right now the pressing issue is education because our kids are our future. And I remember when I was a child, and I remember what I was taught. And almost everything I was taught seemed to be a distraction for what I really needed to know. And then I was thinking about who developed this curriculum and how long has it been taught. Well, to me, slave owners developed this curriculum. And slave owners also developed the laws. That's right. And it would make logical sense that they are set up to control us, to be slaves and not know it. That's right. And lately I've been spending time with the OSG network and looking at schools and principals and really like thinking about my experience. And I'm like, damn, these schools look, the lighting reminds me of when I go to court, when I've been in jail. You know, being trained to sit in a room when you're a child during the day behind a desk and listen to somebody means it's like being trained to go to jail, being trained to go and sit behind an office and be told what to do. Today, the only one that's like you was like, what is that? So you expect chaos, but within chaos comes calm. So what's going to be the calm? A new education, right? And I don't expect them to give me nothing. I expect them not to give me nothing. I expect me Like, I'm never mad at my opponents for being good at what they do. Even if it means oppressing me, good job. But you ain't oppressing me, you oppressing people with me, I ain't gonna let it happen no more. So I'm only mad at myself for letting people oppress me. And I never have done that. And I've always felt bad for people that don't fight. But at the end of the day, we gonna support ourselves. You know, because we've been crafty. You've been able to make schools. And you've been fighting alone. But really what I want you to know is we got a crew with you now. Maybe you always had one, but this is a different type. We got 100 principals. We got senators that can pass laws based on what we need.
That's right.
We ain't got to look for the answers. We got it. We just got to do it. So in this moment, I think we have to direct our attention to education and how we're going to deal with things for the next 2 years. Because at the end of the day, I don't care what they tell me, ain't going to be no school for 2 years. I can let my kid go to school till everybody's not sick, till this shit is controlled.
That's right.
You know? So I've been talking to the principal. That's why when John introduced me to you, let's meet today and tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
You know? Not talking about the problem, we're going to do something about it.
That's right.
We ain't going to talk on the couch, we're going to get in front of some cameras and people going to see it.
Right.
But again, oppressing us, good job, you did your thing. But it's over.
That's right. That's right.
I ain't mad at
And
you.
that's
bro.
real talk.
Yeah. There's one thing you forgot, man. We got a platform.
That's not, well, we on that's what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah.
we've never had control of information.
That's it.
Of how many times we want to put a certain image in our people's face that are going to teach us instead of distract us.
Control that narrative, man.
We control the narrative. Like, you would never know that our senator in Indiana is this cool.
Right.
They would never let you see that. They would never let you see that this man been passing laws since the day he got there. And he just started. And ran for governor on. You know? But he speaks the same language as us. And that's what we're fighting for. If you don't speak my language, I don't think you're fighting for me, man. Because you can't understand. How you going to fight for me if you don't understand?
That's right.
You know what I mean? So now it's time to make you famous, and you famous, because you've been fighting for us for free.
It's real.
You know, we got to make honor profitable. So maybe more people will do it. Because at the end of the day, it ain't about black, white. It's about broke or rich. And keeping the working class working and fighting each other instead of fighting the people that are oppressing. It's all a distraction.
That's it.
As we wrap up, I want these brothers to give some closing remarks, whatever's on your heart and mind that you want to share with the people out there in the world. We started out with the question, where do we go from here? You know, in closing, what's your thoughts and anything you want to leave with the people?
Well, the only thing I would say is, you know, it's an honor to be of service to children, our children. I consider that a privilege. But I also consider it a challenge to all of us that call ourselves adults. Because how can we stand up as men or as women and not having made life better for our children that's coming behind us? Why should they experience the same problems and the same obstacles that we have experienced year in and year out? And it's we haven't been effective in addressing our problems. We haven't stood up in a way that is generational. And see, we have to affect generational wealth. It was generational wealth that stacked up against us. So we have to attack it that way. And we have to think in those terms. And we cannot be satisfied with so-called training and calling that education. No, education means educated people solve their own problems. They don't solve somebody else's problems. They solve their own problems. And so unless we solve the problems for future generations, 7 generations down the line, we haven't done our part. And so my thing is, when they ask, why do we fight? It's not for the sake of fighting. We're talking about the future. We're talking about the legacy of the planet Earth. And as the custodians of this planet, however that came out to be, it was an African genesis. And that genesis begins with our ancestors and the DNA that flows within our veins. And if we don't accept that challenge, then I don't consider us men and women. It has been a cowardly experience And our youth are demanding that there are no more cowards. And so we must rise to that occasion. So that's what I would say in closing. Thank you.
I would say, it looks like where we're at is a restart, like you were saying. One of the things you mentioned earlier, though, is once again is a battle for the mind. You had an interesting story when you said that you talked to a brother shooting at somebody, I think Port Brooklyn it was. But so you asked him, okay, how many black people you shot at? How many white people you shot at? Not that you should be shooting at anybody, but why you only shoot at black people? Your conditioning, you call whites what, the plug. Conditioning.
They think they're the plug. They make us think they're the plug. They tricked us.
There you go. So, and trick is the answer. I mean, trick is the problem.
The manipulation.
The manipulation.
The warfare is of the mind.
The propaganda.
The controlling of our muscles.
Exactly.
Making us fight the head fake, but the fight is mental.
Exactly.
The self-awareness is the fight.
So there you go. So when we talk about the propaganda and the socialization, so when you have a child, there's a saying, an abundance of water and fools is thirsty. So today I'm wearing Howard University shirt on because we had the first 5-star pick to go to a black school. Now listen, it may sound simple, we're talking about $1 billion industry. It took 2020. As black people, we dominate the sport of basketball. But for some reason, not a black institution has ever had a 5-star black person go to a black school. And this is the awakening and the restart. This is us saying, okay, I see a black man strangled for 10 minutes. I don't think we're going to get justice in the court. So I'm going to get justice on the court and in this industry. And I've heard you say before, take out the middleman. You take out the middleman. We as a people have the wealth physically in us and physically where we're from. Africa has all the minerals in the world. We talked about this the other day, but yet they buy finished products by the middleman later on.
And they make us think it's a country, it's a continent.
Exactly.
And the wealthiest one with the most resources.
And in the so-called ghetto, we have wealth. We have corporations walking around. Whatever you're worth $100 million, you're a corporation. LeBron is doing the best with it. You're a corporation. And yet, what do? They take that corporation, they put it in the hands of Duke, North Carolina, Clemson, Alabama. Alabama had a riot when Obama was elected, but yet they won the national championship on the backs of black boys playing. And you have to eliminate the so-called middleman. You have confidence in yourself. We have to go back to have confidence in ourselves to do what we need to do. If I need water, bread, or whatever, get it from yourself. And we're going there. I think this restart is what we're going to restart teaching our children. This restart, getting away from the traditional school, getting away from Brown versus Board of Education, getting away from the fact that we're getting other people, our children, to do some miracle, like you're saying, going to the slave master, the slave to train the former slave. It's ridiculous. So when you look at this charter movement and you see the foundations behind it, it's the same foundations that were there in the South years ago that were educating people, giving Booker T. Washington money, and Booker T. did the best he could, but the wealth back then said, look, we want manufactured workers, so train them. Now wealth now says, look, we want this, we want prisoners, so train them. It's the same wealth. All you gotta do is get away from it. The world is bigger than this elite that runs it. So that's what I'm saying. It's a restart. It's a time for us to come together and be bold. We have to be bold, though. We have to look at past mistakes and not make them. And have confidence in ourselves, eliminate the middleman, and move forward.
Closing remarks, Dan?
You know, there's a lot of layers, like an onion. But the most, I think, the issue that I think we should focus on right now is that for the next 2 years, we're going to have to get money in the house. You know, things are going to change. And everything you've been doing before, what you've been planning for, you now have to plan different. So sometimes some of my friends call me, not sometimes, as of recently, and like, yo, I need a shout out for my album. And I'm like, why are you still acting like the world's gonna just come back the same? You can't put an album out, you can't talk. You have to make up for 70% of your earnings right now because you have to be around people to get that 70%. You got to figure out how to fulfill that. So if you've had a plan before the end of the world, and I say the end of the world not in a bad way because the world wasn't that good right now. It for us.
Mhm.
It didn't behoove us, it behooved them. Your plan was how can you fit in or survive in a world that behooved them. It's a new world. You need a new plan. Education, you need a new plan.
That's right.
Medical, you need to understand how to take care of yourself from your house. Because you don't want to go in the hospital because most people don't come out. You have to know how to make money from the house. You have to know how to educate from the house. It's just not the same world. It's not going to just go away. And just because you're used to being unhappy doesn't mean that that's normal. If you weren't happy before the end of the world, then you should be happy that the world ended before you did, so you can have a new beginning with the new beginning of the world.
Mhm.
And you have to have the answers. Because soldiers are going to have questions, generals are going to have answers. Generals look forward to a war because they've been trained to fight. Soldiers are trained to be told what to do, to be given orders. You know, I'm sitting in a room full of generals. I've only affiliated myself with generals. The reason why I mess with the senators is because I've seen him be about that action. Frontline, intelligent action. You know, I think we have to realize that the world, legally, the only way to make something legal is to make a law. So if we understand what we're saying, the passion, think about what it means if you really want change. Talk to that man how to turn it into a law. And figure out how to make a law. Figure out how to make $1 for the house. Figure out how to get education for the house. Everything, like when y'all was sitting talking about your man Earl, it made me feel like this is the only reason why I could do what I could do today. Because he passed me out on that gun. Because he gave me pride. And the person that passed him the gun usually doesn't get the recognition. You know? But if I am not who I am now, they did all that in vain.
That's right.
They cleared the way for me. So I'm going to take full advantage of it. You know, there wasn't internet, there wasn't cameras. You know, I don't know what the world was like before, but I don't know if you could have a television network, but we got one. We got a network, we can do everything they can do and better with more swag. And they're looking for answers just like the rest of the world is looking for answers. So we should be the ones that give it to them. And if you were planning, or if you're planning, if you're doing anything you were doing the same way before the end of the world, you're doing it wrong. Everything you're doing got to be new, or adjusted, or evolved. There's no emotion. I don't want to hear talk, I want to hear action. The only appreciation for what people have fought for is action, and the right action. Frustration and breaking shit, I could dig it brings awareness. But after what? You want to cut hands? You know? The only way to beat this game is to get rich. That's it. Figure that out.
Your mouth to God's ears. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. The State Senator Eddie Miller live here at Date Dash Studios. We had a phenomenal and strong and powerful conversation, digging deep into the issues and how we can transform our community. So much love and respect to you, brothers. Thank you for the opportunity. We're gonna do it again.
One question. What's the newest law you getting passed?
Man, when I was sitting at the table over there, hearing you talk about how prison inmates are treated and the food that they have to consume, now I have to do my research. I gotta go back home.
That's why I fuck with him.
That's right.
And I'm accountable now.
Exactly. Awareness means responsibility. And he takes that serious. He's a real dude.
That's real.
So now let's do that investigation. Let's figure out how they treat them dealing with COVID. When we talked to you guys on the phone yesterday, how they feed them. You know, I'm learning that they got to pay co-pays in prison. You know, in most prisons across the country. And when they get out on parole, paying parole fees. It's a debtor's prison.
Exactly.
So I know we've been talking about police reform, but just the whole gutting in criminal justice got to happen.
Right.
So that's my charge.
Exposure.
On top of the education conversation that we have, the economic empowerment conversation that we have. But, you know, my colleagues in the Black Caucus in Indiana, this is the fight that we fight every single day.
That's right. And your fight is our fight. All of our fights. It's a national, it's a global fight. Because you can transport any issue that we're having anywhere our people are. I don't care if we're in Brazil, I don't care if we're in Lagos, Nigeria, or Accra, Ghana, or any other country. You can understand that our issue is going to be an issue of reclaiming our land, our resources, and our power. We have to reclaim that. And it's the same issue regardless. Any way that it can be exploited, like Dane said, that's what they're supposed to do. That's what they're supposed to do.
You can't get mad at them for taking the opportunity to expose.
But we have too much sense to not counter it. And that's where we're at now. We're in the counter stage.
We in it, bro. It's happening now. Generals stand up, soldiers sit down, but don't act tough later. Because I'm watching. And tell them.
That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much. Peace.
Thank you. Stay in though. Do me a favor, can you I just want you to talk into both cameras and talk about how you get a law passed. Talk about the importance, because I think that's the thing, you know? That's what makes you a little different. Because you understand that game and get lost in it. And that's why you be a great president. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Yo, is my phone, you got my phone?
You want to stay live?
No, let me get it. But I want to